Senator Tom Cotton, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being with us from Washington. Let's start with the Benghazi report that came out earlier this week on Tuesday. Some new details in that report. We learned that the CIA may have missed some looming threats in some of their intelligence reports that they did. We've learned that the Defense Department did not meet some response times for some military action. You've been very critical of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but it seems like the CIA and the Defense Department have some pretty equal, if not greater, blame in this. Don't you agree?
Well, this is what Hillary Clinton called her biggest accomplishment in one of the emails to which we now have access. And it's well known that she was one of the strongest advocates for action in Benghazi in 2011 that led to the kind of chaotic and anarchic scene that put so many American lives at risk in places like Tripoli and Benghazi. So I think we have to get back to the root of the very poor judgment she showed in urging the president to take this kind of action in the first place. Certainly there is some room for improvement in the Department of Defense and other agencies' performance in Benghazi, but at root, Hillary Clinton is responsible as Secretary of State for the safety and security of our diplomatic missions, and it was her desire to go back to Libya in late 2012 and showcase what she thought would be her biggest accomplishment as Secretary of State that we now know led Chris Stevens to be in Benghazi and led the State Department not to provide the adequate level of security needed in Benghazi and around the country. And these, in my opinion, again, are just very troubling instances of poor judgment on her part that disqualify her from being the Commander-in-Chief.
Well, what do you make of Ambassador Stevens' sister, Ann Stevens, who was quoted this week as saying, "I do not blame Hillary Clinton or Leon Panetta in this particular Benghazi instance there"? That is a conscious clearing statement to some. That has to carry some weight with you that the sister of the deceased would not place blame on Hillary Clinton.
Well, it does, and my sympathies go out to Mrs. Stevens and the entire Stevens family. Chris Stevens was a great American. He was an extremely accomplished and brave diplomat. Of course, 3 other Americans lost their lives in Benghazi, and Hillary Clinton lied to the faces of their families at the repatriation ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base, saying that the attacks were caused not by a planned and deliberate terrorist attack, which we now know that she knew at the time, but rather they were incited by a video on the internet. Again, this is just one of the many details the report reveals of Hillary Clinton's poor judgment and negligence before the attacks, during the attacks, and after the attacks.
Let's move to what has happened this week, transpired in Turkey this week. We saw just another horrific terrorist incident in Istanbul. This one's a little more troubling to me in that there were no security checkpoints that were violated in this. These folks pulled up in a taxi and apparently opened fire and then self-detonated themselves. What can you do? What would you recommend we do to prevent those types of situations from happening? It seems a little bit outside of our control.
Well, we have to do more, and we have to do it faster. For years, the president has dismissed the threat of the Islamic State. He withdrew all of our troops from Iraq in a very hasty fashion in 2011 that created the conditions to allow the Islamic State to return. He didn't do in Syria exactly the kind of things that we imprudently did in Libya when that country was descending into civil war, and gave the Islamic State even greater room to grow and develop safe havens to launch these kind of attacks, which are now occurring with almost complete impunity in major cities all around the world. Ankara, Istanbul, Brussels, Paris, San Bernardino, Orlando. As you say, the attacks in Istanbul just reinforce that you can't build a defensive perimeter big enough to prevent against attacks on your homeland. You can put checkpoints at the concourses, you can put checkpoints at the doors to the airports, you can put checkpoints on the highways. Eventually, you can't put a checkpoint everywhere in every part of society. You have to take the war on offense to the Islamic State where they're located in places like Iraq and Syria and Libya, and the president simply for too long has done too little and too slowly to take that fight to them.
I want to stay on some international affairs, but I want to pivot to Donald Trump, the presumptive GOP presidential nominee. We'll get to some talk about you and Donald Trump a little bit later on, but he said earlier this week too about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He compared it to, quote, a continuing rape of our country. That is a very sexually violent, explicit term to describe a trade agreement. Do you condone or condemn that type of language that Donald Trump's using to describe a trade agreement?
No, I don't. It's not the language I would use, and I disagree with it as well. I don't think it's a clear-cut case, though, whether the Congress should ratify the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I generally believe that trade with other countries makes us more prosperous at home. It helps create jobs, whether it's, say, in the Arkansas agriculture or aviation industry that are shipping goods overseas, and helps reduce the price of goods at Walmart and your local grocery store. That said, each trade deal has to be evaluated on its own terms to ensure that it is, in fact, a good deal for Arkansans and for our country as a whole. Congress is still undergoing that process. I don't think we can ever just assume that a deal, because it's labeled a trade agreement, should be automatically presumed to be good for the United States.
Where are you on the TPP right now? Do you support it at this point?
Well, I'm still evaluating it, Roby. We don't expect to vote on it until at least after this year's election, and maybe not in the next year. So we obviously have a few more urgent matters in the Congress whenever we're not voting on something for 6 to 9 months at least. There are some industries in Arkansas that benefit from it. There are some industries that are hurt by it. So it's 5,000 pages long, very technical. Not just reducing tariffs and other kinds of trade barriers, but creating some regulatory schemes that are going to cross international borders, about which I have my doubts. But by the time it comes up to the floor, I'll obviously have done a very thorough job in evaluating it for the people of Arkansas.
5,000 pages, that's just bedtime reading for you. Another statement that Donald Trump made this week too, he said that he would repeal NAFTA if he's elected president. Do you support a repeal of NAFTA?
I do not, Roby. In fact, I think after Great Britain's vote last week to leave the European Union, we should at least consider an invitation to Great Britain to join NAFTA. If we do so, of course, we would want to update some of its terms. NAFTA was drafted in the early 1990s before the rise of the internet and e-commerce, on which countries like the United States and Canada and Great Britain depend so heavily. But on balance, I think it's actually helped keep a lot of manufacturing jobs in the United States by reducing supply times and moving high-end jobs that pay more and have better benefits to the United States. And again, with Great Britain leaving the EU, as Donald Trump himself said last week, we should move immediately to try to cement our trading relationship with them, since they are the world's 5th largest economy and one of our oldest allies in the world.
Now, you've said on a couple of occasions this week you are not being vetted for the VP post for the Republicans in this 2016 election, so I will leave you at your word on that. But will you be at the GOP convention in Cleveland in mid-July? And if so, what do you expect your role to be? What will you be doing with your time in Cleveland?
No, Roby, I'm not being vetted, but I will be at the convention. Obviously, we have dozens of Arkansans going, and I'll be spending much of my time with those Arkansans, speaking to them, hosting a dinner or a breakfast or two with Arkansans, also speaking to some of my other senators, state delegations as well, and meeting with some of the key party influencers and leaders and activists from around the country. This is obviously a presidential nominating convention, but is also our Republican convention. It only happens every 4 years, and it's a rare opportunity to meet with Republicans from across the country about the direction of our country.
Will you have a speaking role at the convention? Do you want a speaking role at the convention?
At this point, I haven't received any invitations or offers for that. I'll consider any invitation to do so. I'll consider, of course, any request to help any candidate who's on the ballot this year, since I want good people elected to office who are going to help Arkansas and help our country prosper and remain safe and secure.
You have, let's pivot back to some legislative work that you're working on. You have introduced some legislation that will affect veterans and cemetery burial options. This all centers around the story of a veteran named Charles Duncan. I want you to tell everybody just briefly what the story of Charles Duncan and his family and what your legislation would propose.
Well, the Department of Veterans Affairs will cover the burial costs of an indigent veteran. Mr. Duncan died in central Arkansas, but unfortunately federal law only covers national cemeteries, and the Little Rock National Cemetery is now full, so Mr. Duncan had to be moved to Fort Smith and buried there, which was too far for his family members to attend the service or to attend the gravesite. My legislation would expand that benefit to state cemeteries as well. It's a very small gap in the law, but I think it's very consequential for those families who are deprived the opportunity to visit their loved ones who fought for our country. And in Arkansas, we have open state cemeteries in both Little Rock and Bird Eye, which would cover much of east in southern and central Arkansas. For people in northwest Arkansas, they can still be buried in the national cemeteries in that part of the state because those cemeteries remain open. And I look forward to testifying this week before the Veterans Affairs Committee on my legislation, and I hope for the sake of all veterans and their families we can move forward promptly.
All right, you get one more question. We're going to pivot to a totally different issue. We've seen signatures turned in here in Arkansas to get a ballot issue for this November for medical marijuana. There may be another medical marijuana initiative that will come as well. We're releasing some polling later today that will show 58% of Arkansans support medical marijuana. Do you support medical marijuana? How will you vote on that issue if it's on the ballot in November?
Well, I think it's a bad idea to legalize marijuana use. I think Colorado's experience has demonstrated that there's a big difference between decriminalizing marijuana, so we're not putting people in jail for merely possessing, a single dime bag of marijuana, versus legalizing it and giving it moral sanction in our society and even commercializing it so it's on every street corner. I think it's bad for our children, bad for our communities, and ultimately bad for law and order as well, because it leads to so many other kind of follow-on drug use and crime, and it doesn't really deliver the benefits that states like Colorado expected, because a large black market remains and there's not much tax revenue that comes from it.
All right, Senator Tom Cotton, always good to get your thoughts on things. Thank you for making time for us.
Thanks, Robbie.
All right. Thank you, Tom.